I'm Dr. Carol Azuma Dennis. I'm based at the Open University, and I'm the SIG leader for the Educational Leadership SIG Special Interest Group, along with Karen Healy, who will be coming along at some point, but she's got trouble with her boiler and an absent plumber. I'm going to invite those who are presenting to very, very quickly say hello. I would love to say hello to everybody in the room. That would be ideal, but I suspect that would take the entire time. So instead, I'm going to invite you just to say hi in the chat, your name, where you are, and as is the custom at the Open University, please tell us what the weather is like wherever you are, so we get the entire country covered. I'm in London and it's sunny, but it's sunny in the absence of heat. So if I can start by asking Kate to introduce. I'm just following my screen round. So Kate.
Hello, hi everybody. My name is Dr. Kate Carruthers Thomas. I'm a senior research fellow at Birmingham City University, and I'm here today co-presenting with my colleague Amanda French.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Which means I should then go to Amanda French. Please, Amanda, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Azuma. Morning, everybody. Yeah, my name's Amanda French, and I work with Kate at Birmingham City University. I'm a reader in the Department of Education and Social Work.
Okay, that's fantastic. If I can then go to Karen.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Karen Jones. I'm an Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Management, and I'm at the University of Reading at the, the Institute of Education. Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. I do have two co-respondents here, only one of whom is on camera, but I'm sure the other can identify herself and be on camera very soon. Brilliant. But before I come to the co-respondents, I should ask my co-SIG leader to introduce herself. Karen?
Hi, I'm Karen. I'm with the Manchester Institute of Education. I'm currently in Staffordshire and it is definitely sunny.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, that's excellent. And then we have two colleagues who have very kindly agreed to listen to the presentations and to open up with 5 minutes worth of reflections on the presentations each. So if I can start by asking Deborah to introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. Dr. Deb Outhwaite. I'm a visiting senior fellow for education in the Department for Social Policy at LSE, and I work on the EdD programme at the University of Liverpool, but I work largely in practice. So I work with about 500 school leaders in practice in the East Midlands, and it's sunny without heat here too in Derbyshire.
Okay, thank you. And then finally, if I can ask Natalie Tagama to introduce herself.
Everyone, I'm Dr. Natalie Tagama, and I am a postdoctoral researcher and an interdisciplinary scholar, currently based at Queen Mary University of London, and it is again sunny without heat where I am.
Okay. Now, I was under the impression that Bera wanted to show a film before we really kicked off, because I'm ready to go on to the first presentation, but nobody's kicked me under the table to say, Azuma, you've forgotten this. So unless somebody kicks me very, very soon, I'm going to ask our first presenter to get going. Okay, no kicks. Brilliant. So if I can start by inviting Amanda and Kate, who are going to talk about Empower, creating a community of practice and collective ethnography with women leaders in HE in Vietnam. And we'll have a 20-minute presentation followed by 5 minutes of Q&A before we then go on to invite Karen to present. So Amanda and Kate, please.
Thank you, Azuma.
I'm
just going to get the presentation up, so
yes,
we'll wait till that's happened.
It's coming.
There we go. And are you going to put it? Yeah, there we go. Okay, I'll make a start then, Kate, and I'll just ask you to move the slide on as I'm ready. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody, morning. Yes, Kate and I are going to talk to you about a project that we worked on called Empower. It's a British Council bid with colleagues in Vietnam who we've worked with for a number of years on different projects. And this project was focused around a number of specific ideas that we're going to discuss with you today, which was about creating a community of practice and also working towards some kind of collective ethnography with women leaders, but also women generally just working in HE in Vietnam. Do you want to put it over to the next slide, Kate? So our project partners were colleagues from Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, as well as the UK end of the operation, which was BCU. Unfortunately, because of the time difference, our Vietnamese colleagues can't be with us today. They may join. I think they were going to try and maybe join for some of it, but the time difference isn't great. But we have tried to represent their voice in the presentation. And obviously, whenever you work with largish groups of people, it's always unfortunate when they can't be with you when you present. So there is an absence in the room, but hopefully we will represent them. And just to say that for those of you who are interested in these kind of transnational projects, this Going Global Gender Equality Partnerships call is a good one to look out for. Not a lot of money, but it is a good way of getting these kind of partnerships around EDI work, which we all know is difficult to fund. It does offer an opportunity to explore EDI projects in a transnational context. So again, if people have got any questions about that specifically, we'll do our best to answer them. You'll see at the bottom of this screen, there's a link to our website. So anything you want to follow up after today, want to know more about the project, and incidentally some related projects, do click on that link and it'll take you to quite a comprehensive website that will answer all your questions. Okay, Kate, next one. Okay, I think this is something that we're hoping we'll get a chance to talk more about today, which is this idea of coloniality when you're working in transnational projects, and particularly when, as a Global North university, you're working with Global South universities. And specifically, I should think, also working through the auspices of the British Council, which clearly has a kind of colonial background to it, even though it works very hard these days to try and be as egalitarian as possible. And so we just wanted to flag up early in this presentation, and we're very happy to revisit this as a theme, as an idea, about avoiding in these kind of projects just importing a model that we as women working in leadership in the UK think is, a great idea, and we're going to take it over there, as it were, and talk to them about how we do women in leadership. And we were very aware that we did not want to do that. And we're all very conscious that wading into sort of transnational projects like this without that kind of awareness can lead to a sort of neo-colonialism that actually doesn't benefit anybody. And, I'm sure we're all aware of projects that have struggled with difficulties because of that. So we were very clear that we wanted to create a way of working that very much had the collegiality and the collaboration that we were looking to achieve. And both Kate and I will talk later about, how sometimes that works better than others, but it was a guiding principle in the project, I think, that you'll see us returning to. We very much wanted to work as feminists and as women who are interested in the idea of opening up discussions and debates, not necessarily looking for answers. We were not looking to produce best practice or a toolkit or anything like that. What we wanted was to open up on as equal a basis as we can an exchange of ideas and opportunities for this idea of creative self-expression. And we were very aware, as ever, that we were comparatively we were monolingual. None of us spoke Vietnamese, but many of our Vietnamese colleagues spoke English to varying degrees. And we put a lot of thought into having ways of working that allowed people to speak in their own language, or allowed people to translanguage via images or written text, or the lovely Google Translate, and also within themselves as a community of Vietnamese researchers, helping and supporting each other, working with English-speaking colleagues. So although we're not really necessarily going to dwell on that much, I think it's worth raising it, because it you know, when you're co-writing papers and co-producing outputs and, you know, trying to work with people in this open collegiate way, you know, language, especially our monolingualism, isn't always very helpful. So those are some of the issues, I think, regarding coloniality that we were hoping to kind of air this morning. I think, is there anything else, Kate, or can we move on to the next slide?
No, I think, yeah, that's good.
Okay, so this is the nuts and bolts, if you like, just so you get a sense of what the aims of the project were and what we eventually ended up doing. So the aims, as I've said, were about encouraging conversations, encouraging debate, and very important, I think, was our sense, again, working as women working in HE in the UK, and also as women, you know, who were very focused around women's issues, around equality. Both Kate and I have a background in EDI and feminism. We very much wanted a research model that drew out the often hidden experiences of female leaders. And I think in that sense, we were looking to provide safe spaces, spaces where people felt, women, the women we were working with, felt that it was a trusting space, a safe space, a space where they could explore things that perhaps would have been more difficult to open up in other fora, like a focus group or an interview or a survey, although we did do a survey, and we can talk about that a bit later if people are interested in that. But what we really wanted to do, as you'll see in the second box, we wanted this idea of a community of practice. We very much wanted out of that community of practice to talk about peer research, and that was something that Kate led on, so she's going to talk in more detail about that in a minute. We were very keen on the idea of gathering individual ethnographies in order to work collaboratively around ethnography as a research methodology. And again, we'd had experience of doing that in our own work and in other strands of research, but we hadn't done it in a sort of focused way like this in a transnational project. And we had expertise in the group, certainly with Kate and some other colleagues, around using visual and creative methods. And yeah, I'm going to let her talk about that, because that was something that she was involved with very closely. But that was essentially what, you know, that was essentially on the surface what the project was about. Okay, next one, Kate. I don't know whether it's wrong to you now.
Okay. Over to me. Thank you, Mandy. So in terms of the creative methods approach, one of the working with the peer researchers consisted of 3 workshops, virtual workshops. So they were in Vietnam mainly. One person was in Australia, and Mandy and I were here in the UK. But there were 3 workshops, and the first one was based on generating, or intended to generate, autoethnographies. So for those participants to, excuse me, explore their experiences and practice as leaders or as aspiring leaders. And so in order to set that up, I set up a Padlet with 3 themes, as we can see here: the career timeline and pathway, day in your working life, and your experiences or practices as a leader or aspiring leader. And so we I invited the peer researchers at some time before the actual workshop, perhaps a couple of weeks. I can't remember actually now. But anyway, they had time to consider these themes, and then they could post text, they could post visuals, they could respond to others' texts. And so we ended up with a really wonderful, actually rich canvas of their experiences and their thoughts, and also visual stuff as well. so the reason we wanted to include visuals is that visual methods was to stimulate responses and ideas, almost like is obviously we're working in a bilingual environment, almost like a gateway as well to both to creative methods and to discussion and sharing and exploration. And we, as I say, we started with quite a lot of material. You've just got the three themes there, but you know, Padlets can just expand. One of the key themes that came out of that was the idea of carrying and balancing, and that came from this photograph that one person shared on the Padlet. Long journey, heavy burden, and she said, "This is our journey. It's a long journey. It's a heavy burden as leaders or aspiring leaders in HE as Vietnamese women." This was particularly powerful. I think you'll possibly recognise that photograph. That photograph actually comes from the Vietnam War. But you can see that there is the woman is both carrying and balancing as she is walking. And for our participants, that represented a kind of skills and strength and resourcefulness that Vietnamese women need in relation to both professional and domestic responsibilities and expectations in their culture and in HE. And what was really powerful about this photograph in particular is that talking about carrying and balancing actually then led on with a very a diverse group of participants to a kind of cross-cultural discussion of the idea of the second shift, of juggling, and of hidden labour, which, you know, those are words we would recognise potentially, but they're not necessarily phrases that are common in Vietnam. But nevertheless, we understood, the group knew what we were talking about. And what we discovered as English speakers was that the Vietnamese language actually has 27 different verbs for to carry, depending on who or what is being carried or how something is being carried. And so that was I felt that was a kind of a breakthrough moment actually in what had been quite a cautious sort of approach at that point to these creative methods. So actually finding it resulting in this sort of rich discussion was really exciting. And we decided to follow up that discussion on carrying and balancing in the next workshop, which was workshop 2. And again, I set up a Padlet. I sent out an invitation for people to give their thoughts on or share their thoughts on these kind of concepts and on their experiences. And these are some of the texts that were posted on the Padlet. We did also have some further pictures, but you can see the balancing and the kind of long journey and the juggling were really to the forefront, and it was a really, again, powerful way of capturing how the peer researchers felt they were carrying, what and how they felt they were carrying in their professional and private lives. And again, as a sort of a shared sort of discussion, we talked about the overlaps between experiences of women in Vietnam and those in the UK. So there was a lot of drawing on the lived experience in the group. And Mandy's going to read something in a moment that somebody wrote, contributed, but also there was this discussion of how the lived experiences of these women involve planning teaching sessions and the evening meal, creating shopping lists and meeting agendas, remembering to book appointments, not only for themselves, but for family members, checking in with their elderly relatives and children and friends, as well as with those that they managed or their colleagues, keeping up with work emails and remembering to put the bins out. So this sort of constant carrying of tasks day in, day out, often without anybody noticing. And Mandy, I think you're going to read this piece out.
Again, I think if you go on the website, I know we're a bit short on time, so but if the research we did around the sort of scoping of the literature shows that over 50% of people currently working in HE in Vietnam are women, even though less than around 30% are in any kind of leadership position. So this was clearly they're an emerging professional class, if you like, and that was quite interesting. And I think this quote very much sums up what Kate's just said. Because we're running out of time, I'm just going to I'm not going to read it. You can read it in your own time, but you get that general idea at the end where she says, you know, the female researcher has to self-regulate to make a balance between community work and homework many times. And when there is a change in one or two baskets, they must find a way to adapt to the imbalance and then readjust to a new balance, which I think is a lovely extended metaphor that came out of the image. I think it's clear to say the image was posted by one of our Vietnamese colleagues and then was reacted to by different Vietnamese colleagues in various ways, and that was a kind of nice summing up. So we go to the next slide, Kate. I think it's is it me or you? I can't remember.
It's you.
It's me. Right. We were lucky enough to have colleagues in Vietnam who were part of the project, and they were able to run a community of practice workshop actually there in Vietnam with our Vietnamese colleagues. And out of that, they used some creative methods. They did the river metaphor, planning a progression as you go through your career, and also this idea of entanglement and combining and weaving together many different aspects of one's life. And again, Kate, if you go to the next slide, we have lots of comments on these images, and here's one. As a female leader, I face some difficulties at work, such as having to spend time taking care of my family, so I don't have much time, and emotions affect work, and we haven't got time to go into it today, but there was a lot about emotional labour and emotional demands on women that we both recognised ourselves, but often we're operating within a different cultural context in different ways. Okay, next slide.
Okay, so obviously, very briefly, the kind of overall findings of the project, that female leadership in Vietnamese HE is viewed and experienced differently by women and men. That the causes and implications of those different lived experiences are rarely talked about by HE professionals themselves. And then finally, as Mandy referred to at the start of the presentation, we need to constantly interrogate how we work in transnational projects. And, you know, I don't think we thought at all that we were doing everything right in this project. And certainly there are future projects where VCU's involved there, where this has been a learning experience.
Yeah.
And just those final questions.
Okay.
Yeah, these are just ones we might want to return to in the Q&A, Azuma. So we'll finish there if you need us to keep to time.
Okay, well, I would like to keep to time, so I do want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to be heard and do what they've come here to do. We have got 5 minutes for Q&A, and I know that we've got 2 really interesting questions in the chat from Dr. Saud Sleiman from Roehampton. I've probably mispronounced your name, but please feel free to come onto camera and to ask your question. Good afternoon. Could you share the motivations behind this research? Why Vietnam? And for example, why not China? Okay, and shall I ask the other question as well?
I can answer the first one really quickly if you like.
Yeah, go ahead.
Which was that the call, the global partnership call, specifies certain countries that you can work with. And because we had a history of working with Vietnam, we chose Vietnam. I'm not sure whether China was included on the call, but we, for obvious reasons to do with funding as much as anything else, chose to work with Vietnam. Interestingly, we have a project that's a follow-on, if you like, from this project, where we are now working with, we are very much operating as in a consultative role, and our Vietnamese colleagues are taking this model and using it with a group of women in teachers in Indonesia. So we are kind of removing ourselves from the project, but the notion of who you work with and who you get funding to work with was very much determined by the funding call.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that there is an exploration there as well, isn't there? And then the next question we have in the chat is from Lucy Wickyard. It's unverified, so I'm not sure where Lucy is from. Lucy, do you want to come and ask your question? Have you just,
thank you
Lucy?
So much. Yeah, thank you so much, Azuma, and thank you to Kate and Amanda. I am so glad to be in this discussion today, because in June I'm going to Italy to conduct a study that's going to compare women leadership in higher education, case study of Italy and Kenya. So this could not have come at an appropriate time. I'm so excited. And I've written a chapter in a Springer published book on the same topic, women and leadership in higher education. Excellent. So my question was, when you look at the balancing, and when Amanda was reading the quote, I was just wondering, okay, the women fighting so hard to say that if there's a little bit of shift, they then turn around to make the weight to balance. But should there really be a balance? Or is that something that is we've been mentally conditioned in our different cultural contexts to always fight to try and balance? So that was my question. Thank you so much.
Kate, do you want to get started on that one? It's a great question.
I can start. I mean, that's a great question. Thank you, Lucy, and your work sounds really fascinating as well. So, yeah, great question. Absolutely. Why should women have to balance? Certainly, I think Mandy can probably articulate this better than I, but there was let's say there's a greater acceptance, I think, amongst our Vietnamese colleagues of the their roles within society, and I think that there are all sorts of reasons for that, and that does sound, as I say, very generalized, but yeah, so they certainly felt that the balance was required, and that if they wanted to move on professionally, then the balance was essential. But Mandy can probably be a little bit more incisive there.
Yeah, I think that was very much the case, Lucy, that there were a lot of societal expectations, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that the professional class of women working in HE is a relatively new professional class. Obviously Vietnam has a very particular social historical context, which is the war and the way in which the society has built itself up again from the 70s, with a massive input into education. So a lot of the women we were working with were in their 30s and 40s, and they were very much trailblazers. They were the first women in their culture, in their society, in their communities, who had these kinds of jobs, this work that they'd been to. Many of them had been and done PhDs in England, particularly, but Scotland as well. And they'd often done that, brought families with them, their children, their husbands, and there was a sense in which all aspects of what is essentially a very community-based society, Vietnam, was adapting. Everybody was having to adapt. Husbands were having to adapt. Mothers-in-law was stepping in. So obviously a project like this, which is short and very small, can only hint and suggest some of these things. But I think your question is one that will always be my last comment is that question is a brilliant question, and it will apply whenever you look at women in the workplace. That would be my final point. You know, I think a lot of what we raise, you could have done any group of women workers in any country, and I think you'll get that question will come up. And I think you're right that we need to interrogate it and ask about it, and ask why are we still having this conversation all the time that is very specifically about women in the workplace. So thank you for asking it.
Indeed, it is a really interesting question, and one that I know that we can spend a great deal of time on, and we will come back to it because we do have you know, half an hour, 20 minutes, need to check the programme, of group discussion at the end of the presentations. But for now, it remains for me to say thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you very much, Karen, for a really interesting presentation. I'm sure that people will want to look at this again once it goes up on the BERA website. And I hope if you've published anything from it, that you'll give us that publication so that we can also link out to it if there's stuff. And Lucy, we are fascinated by the work that you're doing, and I do hope that you'll let us know about it, however it goes, whatever goes into it. It'll be lovely to be able to do something about women and leadership as a later programme this time next year. I'm afraid I missed International Women's Day, but you know, maybe if I keep on trying, we'll hit it one of these days. And with that, I think that I can ask Karen Jones from Reading University if she is ready to present, which I know she is. And Karen is going to talk about the maternity leave experiences and implication for women's careers and leadership in higher education. So, Karen.
Hello, thank you. Thanks, Azuma. I'll just get my slide onto play. There we go. Okay, so right, so I thought I'd begin by just sort of explaining. So, you know, the link here between maternity leave and leadership in higher education. And I'll start with some statistics. These are UK statistics. I did have a look for some international figures, but really, I'm sure they're out there, but I couldn't sort of gather them together in time for this presentation. But we know that certainly in the UK, and we know internationally, that women are underrepresented in higher education leadership around the world. So some of the statistics here from Advanced HE, this is the most recent round of statistics for 21-22, show the proportion of women in senior positions such as the professoriate and head of institution positions, and also the sort of senior management teams. And you can see that although women have made good gains in higher education and now make up nearly half of the academic workforce in the UK at least, they are a much lower proportion of professors and heads of institutions, and this also varies significantly across institutions and across disciplines as well, between the science, the STEM subjects and the non-STEM subjects. And then when you look at the picture, you dig a bit deeper and you start to look into factors like ethnicity, you see that dips even further. And looking at this from an intersectional perspective, looking at the statistics for Black, Asian and minority ethnic women who are amongst the academic workforce in the UK, higher education workforce, you see that they make up a much smaller proportion of academic staff and a very tiny proportion of professors. And I actually couldn't find the statistics for heads of institutions. Admittedly, that might have been in the document, but it was a very large document, 300 odd pages. So there's something going on here. There are significant barriers for women to progress to these senior positions, and this is, of course, has been the topic of research now for the last certainly growing strands of literature over the last couple of decades and longer. And there are multiple reasons and explanations that have been given for women's, the barriers that women experience progressing to the top, and why they're not represented more strongly in those more senior positions where there's power, decision making, where they've got a voice. And I won't go through all the explanations, but of course we know that there's gender and ethnic bias, there's accusations of misrecognition, exploitation, bullying, cultural sexism and racism, all sorts of different issues. But what we also know, moving on to the next slide, is that there is a motherhood penalty. So compounding all the different challenges that women face, a major factor affecting women's careers is whether they have a child. As simple as that. And who would think that in this day and age we were having to sort of have this conversation? So career breaks for maternity and family commitments are often followed by lower status, part-time work, or not returning to employment. And especially the more children that you have, especially as you go on to the second and particularly the third child. And there's also issues of work-family conflict, all this juggling and balancing that we've just heard about in the last presentation. So when, for women who find themselves doing all this juggling, balancing, and if they are also working in very inflexible or hostile work climates, that can be a really significant cause of women opting out of academic careers, in other words, dropping out of the system. And you see that more so in some of the male-dominated fields of the sciences. Now, even though this is kind of pretty well recognised as an issue, there's surprisingly not huge amounts of research. There has been research into academic mothers, a whole strand of research around early motherhood and the challenges that women face, looking at family policies, and research looking at maternity policy as well. And this generally highlights exhaustion and disadvantage among academic mothers, but less specific attention has been given to the actual maternity leave period. You know, what happens, how is that dealt with? Apart from research mostly on policy, maternity policy, what that has shown is that women do experience inequitable family. There is inconsistency in maternity policies, occupational policies across institutions. There's a great deal of variation, and some of the eligibility criteria excludes women who are not employed on permanent contracts. So if you're on a temporary fixed term contract, you could well find that you are not eligible for enhanced occupational maternity cover. So that's a key problem that's been highlighted in the research. Now, one of the issues that came to light more recently in research is this very highly competitive neoliberal environment that women are working in, and how this might be presenting additional challenges to women when they take maternity leave. And there was just one study that I came across at the time I was doing my research for this paper, where this had been tackled, and that was from Kata Patz, who's based in Australia, and she'd conducted research looking at a group, I think it was about 30-ish women in 35 women, I think, from Australia and New Zealand. And what she found was that the very highly competitive corporatized environment of higher education was prompting women in the maternity leave period to actually relinquish their maternity rights effectively by continuing to work through maternity leave. I was at the time working with a data set of conducting some secondary analysis of data from a global online survey of academic career breaks. And I was finding the same thing in my research. So I saw an opportunity here to investigate this on a much larger scale because I had a much larger data set to hand. So I'll turn now to my, sorry, I missed this slide. I'll turn in a moment to my research. This slide is just referring to Hapat's et al. To their research, and it was with 35 women, as you can see here on the slide. So addressing this paucity of international large-scale research on maternity leave in academia and the sort of under-theorising of the influence of neoliberalism on maternity leave experiences, I decided to sort of bridge this gap in the academic literature through secondary analysis of the data that I was working with at the time. So I'll tell you a little bit about the study next, just a brief overview. So this global mixed method online survey received over 5,000 responses, and it was a generic survey looking at academic career breaks. And within that, there was a sort of a subgroup of women, over 553, who had their most recent career break was due to maternity leave. And so from then on in the survey, they were sort of prompted to refer to their most recent career break and what they did in that. And I checked the data, the open text responses in the data sort of corresponded with maternity leave, which they very clearly did. So there were 553 women academics. Just over 80% had previously taken maternity leave, and the rest were currently on maternity leave at the time of the survey. And they were from a range of different roles: teaching and learning, learning, research, and other academic roles. You can see the breakdown of the sort of levels they were at in the higher education professions. So there were a small number who were still PhD candidates, lots of postdocs, lecturers, but also people right through to senior positions, so associate, senior professors, senior lecturers, professors, and senior leaders. And they were roughly split between the arts and STEM subject areas rather neatly. And you can see that they came from countries all around the world, although the majority were from the UK, 82%. There was still a large number of participants internationally from lots of different countries, which you can see on the slide there grouped together. So the survey, as I said, was a mixed method survey. It had a number of multiple choice questions and closed questions, and then open text responses where participants could give more details of their answers. And what I'll focus on here is the part of the survey that sort of led from this question. So one of the questions was in the survey asked participants if they undertook any of the following work duties during the period of the most recent break. And what I found was that there was a very it was very clear that people had done a lot of these activities. So responding to emails, working on projects before maternity leave, or starting new projects while they were on maternity leave, writing papers, or that they'd either started before or they started while they were on maternity leave, doing outreach activities, supervising students, attending meetings, teaching, etc. Now, there were many more activities, but they sort of fell under what I would call the category of kind of more keeping in touch with the field. So keeping in touch with your mentor, going to a conference, things like that. So they weren't quite as demanding as the core academic responsibilities that I've listed on this slide. So I split them up, and I'll just focus on these core academic duties that were undertaken whilst on formal periods of leave. And at this point in time, I'd like to prompt Dan to put a poll up, because I thought it'd be quite nice to engage everyone with this. And if you have taken maternity leave or paternity leave or had any sort of leave that you'd like to comment on, have a go at doing the poll if you can, and just say, did you do any of these things while you were in that formal period of leave? See if this resonates with you. And I became, you can see the percentages here, and I became really interested in why women were doing this. So I turned to the qualitative data because they were asked, if you did any of those things, they were asked to sort of explain why. And there were some really detailed answers given in those sections, and I was able to analyse that data thematically. And what I found was that there were broadly 4 different kind of orientations towards labouring, as I called it, through maternity leave. And I grouped these and gave them names. And I'm not suggesting here that the participants were fixed into these particular categories, that they can never change. I think this just gives us a sort of, it's a useful way of untangling what was going on here and the kind of motivations, what was driving women to do this. So I named these 4 particular kind of groups as I found them linked to my different themes. I named them as scholars, collegials, entrepreneurs and careerists, and I'll go through each of these in turn and explain what I mean with some examples of the data. So the scholars were in a minority. It was a small proportion of the sample. And they sort of really, what they said about the reasons for working during maternity leave resonated with this sort of free choosing neoliberal subjectivity and the idea that the neoliberal philosophy of time, where private and professional work time is blurred. We've got this sort of unbounded nature of academic work, and the neoliberal notion of the ideal academic worker, who's a sort of really enterprising individual who's constantly active, on the go, keeping going, keeping their mind or brain active, which came up a lot in the data. And you can see that these participants said they worked because they love what they do, they love their job, they enjoy these activities, it's their passion, their interest. And as I said, the brain came up a lot, so I need to keep my brain active. I enjoy it. I enjoy being able to do the things I do. It was a bonus, as nothing was expected of me. And my brain didn't stop working in maternity leave, quite the opposite. I experienced a surge of creativity. And so this was all about love. It's sort of love, and it kind of was reminiscent a little bit of this era of dreaming spires and ivory towers, and although that predates the neoliberal university, it sort of had that kind of throwback to that era. But as I said, this group were in the minority, and the majority of the sample, all the other 3 groups, said that they continued to work during maternity leave, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And the word had came up repeatedly. So the collegials felt they had to because they felt obliged or responsible. So they sort of epitomised this sort of responsibilised neoliberal subject. They had a strong sense of duty, as this person said, in hindsight, I tried to keep going with too many job-related duties. Other people said I felt responsible, felt obliged to the team, obliged to my line manager. I felt I had to, there's no one else to do it. No one took over supervision of students. Interim supervision arrangements broke down for doctoral students. And then there was another person who had the unexpected departure of the person covering for them, meant that they had no cover at all, and there was a list of loose ends, no proper handover, and they said professors also don't get maternity cover, so no one else to do it. and not so much due to motivation. I was quite poorly, but necessity to keep my team financially afloat. So you sort of get some hints there at some of the other pressures that are occurring for these participants. Our entrepreneurs, what we can see here is that they were really absorbed by the publishing game. And for me, this I kept seeing in my mind this conveyor belt that they were sort of knocking out publications like I don't know what, you know, they just needed to get them out, get another publication out, get another publication out. And a lot of this was driven by competition with themselves and competition with their colleagues. So a lot of the comments here were around this sense of not being left behind and being compared to their single childless colleagues whose research outputs and productivity far exceed theirs. There was this feeling that you can't take proper time out when doing research, that peers keep publishing, and as you can see in the quotes here, I felt I had to keep publishing. I couldn't publish less than them. So I already felt that by making the decision to have kids, I was not conforming to the ideal academic type. So that term ideal academic is coming up again. And then my last group, I'm whizzing through these really fast, but I hope you're keeping up. My last group was the careerists. And for them, there was this terrible fear, and it was really fear that was driving them to work. And they, in many respects, at one point I was trying to decide, are they more like the entrepreneurs, because they were very similar. They were very driven around publishing and keeping up with colleagues, but there was a really strong fear that was sort of really pushing them forward to and causing them to effectively give up their maternity leave and continue to work through this period. And it was summed up by some as fear of career death. So their career would have collapsed if they hadn't. And sometimes they saw that as being imminent at the present time, or it could be long into the future that their career would suffer, but they couldn't take that chance. So even when these women were, you know, continuing to contributing to work through the maternity leave, upon the return, many of them still experienced challenges. So I also looked at the implications of maternity leave for their careers and for career advancement. And typical comments were that they still felt they were paying the price now. Those that had even after continuing to perform and continuing to produce high quality outputs, they still felt that they had experienced punitive measures. They weren't seen as dedicated. There was this sort of creeping invisibility that came over them, and it was difficult. Sometimes it was difficult to pin down, difficult to speak out about, but they just felt they weren't championed or defended as much. And that was really had quite a corrosive effect on the confidence of many of the women and their sense of belonging in their institutions. So my concluding comments, it never ceases to surprise me. Every time I look at my own data, I just can't believe that this is happening in this day and age, that we were having, after all this time, that we're having to sort of defend women's entitlements. There's a legal precedent here for women to have maternity rights. There are good reasons for this. And, I can't believe that we're still having to defend this in this day and age. And I think that, institutions need to do more to embed maternity policy and improve support for academic mothers. And they need to also revisit what their actual practice to see what's happening on the ground, because the current family-friendly and maternity policies and equal opportunities policies are at odds with the reward systems in academia, and that, I believe, is undermining equal opportunities policies. And on my final point here is that there are potentially serious implications for women. We know that from other strands of research that maternity leave is associated with improved maternal mental health, lower perinatal and neonatal and postnatal mortality rates and lower child mortality. And it pains me to say this, but maternal suicide remains the leading direct pregnancy-related cause of death over the first year after a pregnancy. So supporting maternal well-being and supporting women's rights to leave and supporting their careers upon the return to work is absolutely imperative. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions.
That's absolutely brilliant, Karen. Well done. I'm almost inclined to say that it's perfectly timed, give or take 2 minutes. But hey,
I was panicking. It's a lot.
What's 2 minutes between friends? So that's absolutely wonderful. And and of course, well, we have a couple of comments in the chat. Helen Hannah, just a round of applause here, Dr. Karen, complete agreement of what you're saying. Helen may wish to come on and articulate precisely what point it was that you made that she wanted to echo. But Lucy, of course, has another sort of really helpful and insightful question. Lucy, I'm sure that you will come on camera. Another insightful study, ironic that maternity leave has turned into the second shift. Yes. If I can connect it to the first presentation. Lucy, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Azuma, and thank you, Karen. My son is actually a third-year student at University of Reading, so he's graduating in July.
Lovely.
Yes, so for me, I find it ironic that and I think, or rather, these are just my thoughts, that this is it that it is something maybe cultural or that we are so wired that even when there are those opportunities for us to actually unplug, that we can't take the leave for what it actually is, and we just still feel the pressure to keep on working even during our leave, because even if it is an issue of I love my work, I love what I want, what I'm doing, but still not taking that opportunity to actually rest, because we know the stresses and the pressures that come with carrying a baby for 9 months and then birthing the baby and then having to be in that recovery phase, but you are not actually recovering because you are still going. So that was just my comment. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I must admit, I'm deeply shocked about your comment about suicide as a cause of death in the first year. That was completely new to me, and that I think is quite surprising. I can see that there is a hand up somewhere. Well, there should be a hand up. Oh, Charlotte.
Hello,
Louise.
it's me.
Hi.
Charlotte. Hi.
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much. I wonder if I could ask a quick question. I'm really interested in this, and at my own institutional level, I've been doing some research around this. And what I'm interested in is particularly, you mentioned policy, and obviously we want to look structurally at what's going on from this neoliberal perspective. But I'm really interested as well. Did you come across any good practice policies, things like this? I've heard, for example, I'm also employed as an associate lecturer at the Open University, and I know, for example, that there is I've read about this. I don't know how prevalent it is actually in practice, that, for example, there's mentoring offered to women before and after maternity leave, not something that happens at my institution. I've read around, when you come back from maternity leave, you have a workload adjustment, or you have a small pot of money for whatever it might be. Now, most of these seem like pie in the sky, dream world to me, but I would love to sort of amass this collection of good practice and experiences like this that we can begin to share, and within institutions explore, well, how feasible would this be? So I wondered if you'd come across any good examples, Karen.
Yes. I not specifically, you know, coming from this research, but other research I've done as well. Yes, and it's something I recommend in the paper. Is the sort of it's a bit like the return to work. Some of the schemes that are on around, like the Daphne Jackson Trust scheme and things like that, where there's some additional support offered, whether it's a bit of teaching buyout to do a piece of research or a mentor or something. There's all sorts of different schemes out there, very much along the lines of what you've just mentioned, that can be made available to women, so they don't feel that they have to that they're going to be penalised in some way by having taken that period of time out for their maternity leave, so that they know that when they come back, it's going to be fine. I'm not going to be disadvantaged. But also, so there's those sorts of things. And then, I mean, I do know, for example, in the UK, in the research exercise that we have, the REF, that there is some allowance made where you can, you know, where you can actually, you know, you're given a sort of different, I'm not quite sure how it works actually, they keep changing it, but there's some sort of allowance. So if you've had a period of leave for whatever reason, whether it's maternity or sickness or whatever, and they compensate you in some way in the REF. But I'm also aware that you know, that's down to people's judgment, how many papers you're compensated for example. Yeah, you know. So I mean, I'm talking here from personal experience, because I had a period of very serious illness a few years ago, which required multiple operations and periods of work, and I think I was compensated with one article for the REF, you know. So it didn't really kind of reflect the real impact that period had on my research productivity, to be honest. But you know, I think more needs to be done as well with funding organisations to ensure that they've got provision for maternity leave in their funding schemes. I think, you know, the grant funders. I think the whole culture really needs to be revisited. You know, universities really shouldn't be able to get away with this. You know, and what's really interesting is that none of the women said that they were forced to, that they were told they had to. It was this pressure, it was psychological pressure. And that's what's, you know, that's what's driving it. So this huge pressure, this feeling that you've got to, and like I say, it was a small minority who were saying they did it because they loved it. The majority were by far felt they had to.
Thank you very much, Karen, for your presentation. That was really, really interesting. And so if I can ask Natalie to start, and then we will go on to Deborah.
Thanks, Azuma. I made so many notes. Thank you all for your presentations. I'll try and whiz through my notes and questions. So I'll start with the first presentation. I really liked your starting point. I think thinking about equitable relationships in research, particularly thinking through previously exploitative practices and coloniality. And I think this attempt to neither import nor impose a model. And I was particularly interested in your ways of working. You discussed, for example, people speaking in using their own languages. And I wondered what the implications were for that in terms of knowledge production in the final outputs. Were you still able to be as equitable? What were some of the key challenges with that kind of work and with that mode of ways of working and that attempt to be more equitable within your work? I also really liked your the visual creative methods, particularly the three themes that you created when you created a timeline for the career, a day in your life, in your working life, and the experiences of leaders who were or aspiring leaders. And I think that's when you brought us to the balancing act. And I wondered perhaps what are the implications of that particular exercise or this interrogation on women who are aspiring to be leaders? What can they learn from those experiences? And I think even in terms of, you spoke a lot about the shifting and the balancing and rebalancing as the work progresses. And I'm wondering, what are the implications of that? What can they learn in terms of what is ahead? What can they anticipate in terms of those shifts? Would they, in year 3, you might need to shift in this way? And I think that ties really nicely with Karen's work on maternity and this again need for shifting and balancing and rebalancing based on changes in our personal lives, which is important. And I actually thought it would be really interesting to have perhaps something close to what Lucy is talking about in her work, where she's comparing these experiences in Italy and in Kenya, to have that bring those together, the work in the UK with the work in Vietnam, perhaps to look at, or at least to think through, what are the commonalities across these spaces? What are key challenges, whether you are a female leader in Vietnam or you are in the UK, and what has worked in rebalancing and balancing of this, this act. So thank you so much. It was a great presentation. With Karen's work, I was really, I've been exploring a lot of Nicola Roaloch's work on the underrepresentation of Black female leaders, or Black professors rather, and I was interested in seeing the numbers that you were presenting us with, just, who are the professors in terms of women, head of institutions, and how those numbers just dwindle the more you add, you add another intersection and the number goes lower, you add another one and it goes just ridiculously lower. And I think then adding motherhood and then having this motherhood penalty in a context where we already have this precarity in employment, and I speak as as a postdoc, I'm in the thick of precarity. So it's really interesting to add that. And I think speaking to colleagues as well, it was just a really, really lovely, and I think it spoke even to my personal experiences, given my current role, but also I think being around an office full of postdocs who are in their 30s and they're thinking about motherhood, and they're thinking about this precarity and the excessive pressure to publish, and whether or not even, for some of them having to think through, can I have children in the context of the academy as it stands. So that was really interesting work, and I liked how you brought them together, grouping them in your themes. And I think I was particularly struck by the scholars, because when I've been on leave, one of the things that I do is I feel this greater surge of creativity, but I think it's because all of the other pressures are finally taken off, so I can think properly, so I can write properly. And I think there's something to be said about the pressures of the academy that then mean that you're not able to be as creative as you could be. But then you have this leave and you're like, oh, I'm free to think because I don't have to answer emails. So I think even that in of itself is really interesting. And I think it would be interesting again to perhaps do further research into some of those themes, to think about why is it, what is it that you love about this space and this time, and why do you get this greater surge of creativity? Because for me, it is because I don't have to answer emails. So thank you so much for that. And I think I will end it with, so I have so many, I'll have to email you after. I think the idea of paying a price and the sense of belonging, that also really struck something in me, because I think when women do have to take time out and that feeling penalized, and the effect of that, I think that is felt over a career. And I think doing more research on that, perhaps, I was thinking of longitudinal research, going back to the same women to look what has it felt like over the course of a 5-year period, a 10-year period. And I think that would be really interesting work. So yeah, thank you all. Some really great food for thought.
That's lovely, Natalie, for those reflections. Thank you. I know that Amanda, Kate and Karen will be itching to respond directly to what you have said, but I'm going to ask them just to take a deep breath and to invite Deborah to actually to offer her responses.
Thanks, Az, and thanks, Natalie. I'm going to respond differently, actually, to how I was thinking I'd respond in my 5-minute break that you encouraged us to have without email. As I was really conscious for the first time, I think, of the fact that my 3 periods of maternity leave were all done in different institutions. So I had one as in an FE college, one in a school, and one in HE. My children are quite well spaced. So the one I had in FE was when we were sticking to the Conservative Party spending limits. So we'd had the 97 change of government, but you might remember there were a couple of years where we stuck to Conservative Party spending limits. So some of the decisions that the new Labour government had taken around maternity pay hadn't quite come into effect by the time I had my first daughter, who will be 23 this summer. So that meant I got a month's full pay and then 6 weeks half pay, I think. And I was offered the chance to come back to work after 3 months and was actually expected to come back to work after 3 months. And there was no option. I was a head of department. There was no option at that point to come back as a head of department if you came back fractionally. So you could have your post back fractionally, but you'd lose your head of department role. Okay, and that was standard practice in those days. And I'm just, thinking as Natalie was speaking, actually across the course of our own lifetimes, how much some of this has changed for the better, although we now know that we have gone backwards in quite a few areas. Karen, I totally agree. But you can see those policy echoes globally, Kate and Mandy, with the work that you've been doing, which I thought was just absolutely fascinating. My second period of maternity leave in a school, I had just changed roles. And I didn't know that if you moved sectors, that meant you were ineligible for maternity pay. So I got no maternity pay with my second child because you had to be in post more than a year before you were eligible for it. We'd moved house, I'd changed jobs, and I wasn't quite, I don't think. Even though I had been in post a year, I still wasn't eligible. So that, again, was a very interesting position, but I was allowed back to the leadership role I had on a fractional basis. So you can see, steps advancement and inequalities riven through different types and different parts of the system. And then when I had my third child, I transferred to research stage of my education doctorate the day before he was born by emergency cesarean. And I remember getting the email to say, great, you're through to research stage, off you go, and thinking, how does that apply to me? And there was no acknowledgement of that whatsoever. And through all of that time, as just thinking about what Charlotte was saying, I too had been an associate lecturer at the OU, and the OU had handled that very differently because I think they were used to having part-time distanced staff, and I was very clearly told what the expectations were on me. And I was entitled to, a year's maternity leave with my third child. I got paid for more than 6 months of that, I think. And I went back to work early because my team needed support. Somebody else had got a career promotion. We were short-staffed, and I chose to go back in order to support my team. So, Karen, I thought your categories were absolutely fascinating in that research in terms of, what happens. I remember when I was doing my master's at LSE, 96, 97, I remember those, great professors I was working with, everybody publishing collegiately, doing research projects across students and staff, thinking about, the good of the field and what they wanted to get out, thinking full of optimism. And actually, it's that neoliberal impact, I think, that resonates the most with me about how the system and structures have changed, about how we have, as Natalie's well just pointed out, really reinforce that sense of precarity that we have as an industry, because that's what it has become. And a lot of that collegiality then pits us in competition with each other, as opposed to thinking about the way in which we want to work and the reasons why we came in to education in order to want to work and support students and staff alike. I've not long written another, Lucy mentioned her Springer book chapter. I've not long written a comparative Springer book chapter myself on the Malaysian context and EDI in HE in the Malaysian English context in terms of that policy borrowing that goes on. And Kate and Mandy, I thought your presentation was absolutely fascinating, and I would have loved to have heard longer and to hear Mandy read out the resonances in that quote. Actually, I know we're always, have to keep to time in these things, but I think, the interesting nature of the fact that we know education is one of our biggest colonial exports. As chair of BELMAS, I was lucky enough to go to Paul Miller's education conference in Jamaica last October, and I went to a primary school and a secondary school, and I saw this English education model, being run out today, well into a couple of decades into the 21st century, totally not fit for purpose for the people who, are still effectively subject to that way of education. Does not suit them, doesn't suit their landscape, doesn't suit their culture, and of course that applies, globally over, and we still income generate as a nation. The last time I saw a figure on it, it was something like £750 billion a year to the British economy for the cost of exporting that British model. And I'm really fascinated by the fact that you've created a space for those Vietnamese participants that you had that was feminist, it was collegiate, it was enabling that creative space for people to think about what came from and resonated with their own cultural context. And I have to say, it made me feel, again, very much full of hope for that sort of comparative research, because so often it's about the policy borrowing context and watching our own stuff played out differently or inappropriately, or it's about that policy stealing effectively, whereas your research is so different to that in enabling that whole kind of safe space and community of practice. I thought to want to encourage that conversation and debate was, really genuinely fantastic, and I wish so much more of our research could actually look like that. So 2 really different but really challenging presentations, and I wonder if they just say more about the sort of contradictions that we have in education, both domestically and globally, as we find it at the moment, really.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you both for those observations. I kind of like feel, we can go 2 ways. We can either give both Amanda, Kate and Karen a chance to most immediately respond to the comments which have been made in any way they want to do that. But of course, I would really like to invite people in the room who are here to ask a question. So there are no outstanding questions at the moment. There are people apologising that we've run over their lunch break, so they're going to have to go back for their afternoon's session. But I wonder if I invite first Amanda and Kate, and then Karen to respond to, if they want to what Natalie and Deborah have said, and then while they're doing that, to invite you to put your comments in the chat if you have a question, or raise your hand and we can go to you. We do actually have about half an hour for chat. I really did want this to be a nice full conversation between ourselves. So and I've kept colleagues to time in order to make sure that time was protected for some exchange. So please, let's start. Amanda and Karen, then sorry, Amanda and Kate, then Karen, and then we'll go back to the chat.
If Kate's okay with it, I'd like to respond just very briefly to the comments made by both both Deborah and Natalie. Thank you so much for such thoughtful responses. I think it is massively important that women established in HE, and I'm nearer in age, I think, to Deborah, and my experiences of childbirth were also in the 90s. I feel a very strong pull that we are moving backwards, and that women in HE who've established a career in HE have an obligation, from my point of view, I feel I have an obligation to support the women I work with, especially the younger women I work with. And, you know, I've been in management positions and one thing and another. And, you know, I feel these kind of pushbacks, the institution is too monolithic, and, you know, they move in the way they move. You know, they're like liners, aren't they? But I think on an individual basis, as Deborah and Natalie was, it's about making that difference on the ground and insisting that, you know, things like maternity leave, adoption leave, parental leave, illness, Karen talked about, you know, extended bouts of illness. You know, these are things that need to be respected. And what's interesting in my experience is exactly what Deborah said. A lot of the policies are a lot better now than they used to be, but they're honoured in the breach. And they're honoured in the breach because managers are complicit with people self-censoring and managing their own careers in ways that are often very damaging to them. So for me, personally, it is, and I, you know, I'm at the end of my career now, but I still feel very strongly that if you're in there and you've got a position, particularly women in, yeah. So that's my response. You know, it's a very personal response, but it feels like it's important to push back individually and to practice what you preach, as it were. Yeah, and work as a support for women who are further, you know, earlier in their stage of their career, and stop them self-sabotaging and damaging themselves. Because the institutional policies are pretty good these days, but they are honoured in the breach. That's certainly my experience. That's my little rant over.
Okay, thank you. Kate, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I've just got a couple of points, specifically in relation to Natalie's commentary. Thank you, Natalie. And one of the things you were talking about was commonality and key challenges shared across the research group and cross cultures. I'll just go back to, it's quite a simple point really, but just go back to one of the points around our key findings, which is that, you know, these differences in lived experiences between men and women in Vietnam HE leadership are generally not discussed. They're just sort of, I won't say they're accepted, but they just are, and people don't discuss them. And I don't think the women in our project were likely to discuss them amongst themselves either, as a sort of a, you know, day-to-day conversation. And so I think what the project did was open up that opportunity for those individuals, and Amanda and myself, of course, to share those experiences, and in so find a kind of commonality and shared experiences, and perhaps even community across university colleagues or several universities. And I think that work was continued also in the community of practice, which I wasn't at the final one, which was, you know, the one in person in Vietnam. But what I understand is that, you know, these people were in this room doing this crazy stuff with ribbons, and it involved more staff than the peer researchers themselves. You know, it was a larger grouping, and that other people in the university were quite fascinated by what was going on, and that in itself sparked conversations, and also it wasn't just the content of those conversations, but the way of working that was going on that sparked curiosity and further conversation. So perhaps another way of sort of opening up spaces for discussion. And the other thing you did ask about outputs. I mean, obviously projects have to hit these usual targets of journal articles and stuff, and we're working on one at the moment, and Mandy is working very hard to, you know, ensure that all voices are represented, and it is challenging. It's challenging for both sides because of language, time differences, all that kind of thing, ways of writing, etc. But Mandy and I are also going to be presenting at the second International Creative Research Methods Conference in Manchester in September around this research, but around the creative methods and specifically around working transnationally with creative methods. So again, there's a way of sort of pushing off into other directions, I think, with the methods, but also absolutely, you know, giving voice to the findings of the research.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. Karen, did you want to respond to either Natalie or Deborah?
Yes, thank you. There were lots of thoughts. I've jotted down some ideas because I knew I'd forget. So just going to Natalie's point about, first of all, about creativity in periods of leave. And, you know, I, you know, that came out in the data, having this surge of creativity during this period of maternity leave because there's no other pressure. It was a luxury. And for me, that raises the question, what is happening in the higher education sector, in the workplace, on the ground, where we are supposed to be creative people, as we can just see through Amanda and Kate's work, you know, really creative. Well, you know, where's that? And as Deborah mentioned, that collegiality years ago, people would be creative, they've worked together. What's happened to that? Why can't we have that? Why is it that you have to have that, you know, that your best opportunity for those when you're on maternity leave? I mean, it's just crazy, isn't it? Crazy situation. So, you know, we should be sort of interrogating our own practices, our own institutions, and raising these questions and kind of, you know, going on about it a bit, like Amanda mentioned, being that kind of voice for other people. You know, it's not just women here. I'm sure that, you know, this is common across all staff in the sector. So where is the creativity happening in higher education, and what can we do to create spaces for that to happen in other ways, not just when you're on maternity leave? I also picked up on the points about precarity and, you know, the very precarious employment contracts that many people are employed on now, and that the situation Deborah mentioned and that you mentioned as well, Natalie, with your friends, came out a lot in this research. I also conducted another project with this data set, just looking at postdocs, looking at postdoctoral careers and looking at the different reasons they'd had career breaks, and looking at that from a gendered angle as well. And the situation for postdocs in particular is really precarious because they are often on contracts where they don't meet the eligibility criteria for occupational maternity schemes. And so in addition to having to work out how to fit in a child or some personal life at this, you know, should they have a child, shouldn't they, you know, how they're going to fund that if they're, you know, if they're not getting maternity, you know, effective maternity cover. There's also the strong possibility that they could end up out of a job. So, you know, for example, if a contract comes to an end during the period of maternity leave, there might not be an opportunity to pick up another contract as you would do normally. There's also the situation where as is the case with most maternity policies in higher education in the UK, there's usually eligibility criteria that requires the woman to fulfill a period of work upon the return to work. So, you know, work for so many months after returning. And if you're in a temporary contract and that's going to end during that period, you can't be sure that you're going to be able to fulfill that eligibility criteria. So therefore, you're kind of out of the loop. You're not covered. So there's all these loopholes that exist. So although I agree policies have improved hugely, but it's not been enacted on the ground. But there are also loopholes in the policy that need to be closed up. So that's another point. Okay, and can I have one more thing I can comment on? Okay, the colonialism lens that we've been bringing into this. What is really shocking here is that, in a way, it doesn't surprise me that the data that I saw for the UK respondents, you know, living and working in this system. But what was really quite shocking was just how widespread this was. Although the sample, the international sample, was smaller, it was still quite a large number of participants. And, you know, there didn't appear to be any obvious discernible difference between the experiences of people in different countries. Now, obviously, this needs further research, larger samples, but there was nothing obvious standing out. And it seemed to be that this kind of way that we've got working in the UK, unfortunately, rather sadly, has been exported to other parts of the world as well. They might not have the breadth, but it's moving around the world pretty fast. So these pressures to publish, to be productive, to be the performativity and the formative aspect of academia seem to be prevalent regardless of where people were based. So I'll leave it there with my response to Natalie and Deborah. Happy to take any more comments and questions.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. I have heard, and I don't know whether it's true, that in the States there is no legislative entitlement to maternity leave. It's amazing. You hear those facts and you think, no, I must be wrong. I must have misheard that.
No.
I must have misunderstood that. That's just extraordinary.
Yes.
Extraordinary. But yeah, I mean, you know, I'm sure we'll find things about the UK which are equally as shocking.
But don't forget, because we're at an interesting point, aren't we, in the political cycle, apart from anything else, that there's so many, a lot of the advantages we gained through that 97 to 2010 Labour government came from, indirectly at least, EU rules around social directives that were part of our membership of the European Union. And America, you know, have 20 days, that's all they have. I've just come back from AERA, so 20 days holiday if you're lucky enough to have a job in the first place, and then all your other associated welfare benefits come from your private insurance that you pay for, like your health insurance, or whatever conditions the company who employ you choose to have. And we now live in a country where a lot of other people think that that's a very reasonable model to return us to as a nation. So that there are kind of big kind of struggles, I think, over exactly that, over what our entitlements as women should look like and how much of those actually should be ratified by legal process, particularly now we don't have that EU citizenship which gave us that as citizens of the EU, because they are, you know, agreements that were made and legislated for in European treaties for which we've withdrawn.
And of course, as we watch with deep shock in the States, the Roe v. Wade withdrawal of abortion rights, I think we can't rest on any sense of reassurance that these rights are in the bag and are therefore there and protected. They can disappear overnight, absolutely overnight. I almost sort of feel at this point I have to stop speaking, because of course, as you watch UK politics with an increasing sense of, well, both rage and alarm and fear, balanced almost perfectly with amusement, because it is so absurd. Where does this take us, and what do we do? Except, we know the importance of organising. I do have a question for Amanda and Kate, and of course I am inviting people in the room to please do put your hand up and speak to us. Go on camera and let us know what you think. If you don't have a question but just want to share your reflections, those are also welcome. I'm interested in this thing about decolonization, which is, I know, is a word that flies around a lot in HE, and while I'm thoroughly committed to it, I sometimes feel a little hesitation at, we can take it at a symbolic or a metaphoric level, and of course we know that it's not symbol, it's not metaphor, but really I guess I want to ask you what you feel that you learned from women and their experiences and their approach and their understanding of themselves from women in Vietnam, partly because I think we so generally accept that it goes the other way, and I kind of want to just reverse that question in a little bit, if anything. Maybe there's nothing you would recommend that they learn from us either, but just as a ponder, just to as a thought.
I think by putting ideas about not reproducing sort of colonial models at the forefront of our thinking with the research design, I think one of the things it did for me was, because of the way we organised the communities of practice, I learned a lot about shutting up and making spaces, thinking about ways that would encourage and support. I mean, Kate spoke really eloquently about the challenges and about this idea of allowing people to speak. And we realised that just, sitting about and talking was one thing. But after a couple of these communities of practice, when we were starting to delve more into what, as Kate said, were really obviously quite sensitive areas that people were not clear about talking about, and certainly perhaps we want to talk about them publicly. We often had moments, didn't we, Kate, of kind of not Freudian, but a kind of reticence, a kind of worry that people would be putting themselves out there. Nobody wanted to sound strident. Nobody wanted to sound angry. That's not the Vietnamese way. Forgive and yield, very Confucius ideas around sort of personal. People talked a lot about losing face and keeping face. And, so I learned a lot about how it's not what people say. And often that's where those images came in. The images were often quite powerful in a way that the conversations weren't, or the comments on. So again, we come back to this thing that we haven't really had time to talk enough about. I learned that language isn't always the primary way that people communicate what they feel, and that often those images and metaphors, and as Kate said, that business of doing things that at first people are thinking, God, this is a bit weird. Why are we fiddling with ribbons? Why are we writing? Why are we putting pictures up? And we also looked at using blogs and sort of stream of consciousness, kind of just chucking stuff down in the chat. We were looking for every which way that we could get around these formal ways of communication. And I think what I learned was to be resourceful, to not get frustrated, but to see that reticence came out of another space that I wasn't familiar with. It wasn't my cultural space it was coming out of. So, it's having that commitment to keeping doing it. And as Kate said, we've had challenges around writing collaboratively with our Vietnamese colleagues, and again, we're always looking for ways of trying to do that in collaborative and cooperative ways and creative ways. So I think that's what I've learned. I've learned to be patient, and I've learned to shut up, and I've learned to keep looking for different ways of doing things that weren't necessarily terribly academic. People thinking, is this research? Is this really research? Messing about with ribbons? But our point is, yes, out of it comes interesting stuff.
Okay, that's interesting.
But
thank you.
I think you raise a really good point though, Mandy, around where we connect between, or where the boundary is between research and activism. So if I think about a couple of organisations that we haven't mentioned at all yet in today's session, so we've got When Equality, which I'm assuming Karen's come across, and see there's some of you nodding, so some of the rest of you have come across that, who again have been trying to do research in exactly in this space and, you know, put together practical applications to, you know, help the landscape in this space. And then Women Ed, that I've been, you know, quite heavily involved in. I'm a regional lead for our East Midlands network, where we've been trying to go, okay, here's the first set of gendered data, Karen, that actually shows where women are in terms of pay specifically. And actually, this isn't good enough. We're not tolerating it. You know, we're something like 85% of the profession, and yet all of that gender pay disparity showed that. Thanks for that, Az. That's really helpful in the chat, the link. You know, and Women Ed again goes from, you know, staff in nursery schools through to plenty of staff in HE, and staff in HE who do have an interest in gender and education leadership, of course, like Kay Fuller, that's what her professorship's in, but also staff who are just interested in it, Karen, because they're experiencing it from other disciplines or from a wider education discipline, as your research was showing.
Yeah, I hope people have heard of When Women Higher Education Network, and I particularly hope Lucy and Natalie, as two names I can immediately call out, are aware of them, not least of all because they do the 100 Black Women Professors program, which I've done recently, and it's I'd really recommend it if you can get your university to sign you up to it. And it's not just a CPD, how to be more assertive, but really does challenge institutional structures and systemic inequality, and works with the institution, not just with you as an individual. So that's just a very quick plug for that. I know that there's an interesting conversation in the chat about shared maternity leave, which I think Deborah and Karen you've been having, but I also know that Lucy, you've just put a comment, when thinking about women in senior management levels, how can they navigate institutional culture, especially paternalistic ones, to push for shifts, revisions to institutional policies which are more friendly to the diverse needs of women? I don't know if you want to speak to that comment, Lucy, and whether any of us have the silver bullet in our pocket that can pierce this paternalistic culture in a few words. Lucy.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Azuma. And of course, it's a conversation that can never end today. But I'm just thinking about my own personal experience, because I was in higher education and then moved to a research organization. And one of the things was that we even had women in senior leadership, like DVC. The DVC was the DVC academics was a woman. And yet you find us as faculty were not getting avenues where we could share about our work, find mentoring and networking groups. I had to take a personal initiative to form the group. And that is how we ended up even having this book project that was published. So we have had successive women in senior leadership, but I kind of just see the pull and push, not much enthusiasm in really creating that environment where women's voices can be heard, where they can be able to speak out and really push their agenda. So I was very curious what Amanda, Kate, Karen, Deborah would be saying about this, and the rest of the participants. What can we, how can that be navigated? I don't know. I don't know. Thank you.
I mean, I'm old enough to remember what we said about our dearly departed Margaret, that she was a woman but not a sister, and you know, we know that you know, there is a difference between a demographic and a politics, And this is what we have to be. And, you know, we see it, we don't have to go back to Margaret. We can see that we have a Prime Minister who is keen to send refugees to their death in another country. You know, as we say, Kate, stop me from speaking, please.
Yeah, no, again, another great question from Lucy. Yes, I as part of my job, I also run what's called the Athena Swan Charter for gender equality. It's a national charter within the UK and in other countries, but I kind of lead it within VCU. So I'm, you know, engaging with very gritty questions of gender equality within the organisation a lot of the time. I think that the position of a female in a senior management level, and you say institutional culture, especially paternalistic ones. I've never been aware of any institutional culture that's not paternalistic, but you know, maybe there are some. I don't know. It's a quite a vulnerable position in a way, because it's like, you know, if you are the only one of anything in a room, let's say, you know, if you're the only female, if you're only woman of color, if you're only man of color, if you're you are sort of in a way kind of taking on your shoulders the representation of everybody like that. And it may be that once you're, you know, hitting the higher echelons, actually it's a risk to do that, and it's a risk to fight for these, you know, these shifts and revisions that are more friendly to the diverse needs of women or other groups. I think it takes an extremely strong person to do it, and I'm not criticizing people who don't. So I think it takes, you know, an extremely determined personality to keep fighting for those things, as well as manage all the other things that are going on. So I don't have the silver bullet, I'm afraid. No silver bullet for me. But
I think though, yeah. Kate, because I entirely agree. I wonder if when we then see, as we have done recently, people of colour, people from different minority backgrounds speaking out against some of those advances, just like we hear women in the States and occasionally here as well speaking out against women having reproductive rights, it does and should make us realise the fragility of the situation and work together, as was saying, to really make sure that other generations are conscious of that. You know, when I hear younger people occasionally, younger women say occasionally, oh, well, you know, no need for feminism, everyone's a feminist, you know, it's no battle there. Yeah, I mean, I think I hear that less now, in fact, than I did about 10 years ago, because of the issues around reproductive rights. But it is a question, absolutely, Amanda, you know, I agree with you around using our experience so that Natalie's generation have a better experience than we've had, not the sort of, you know, battling one that we've had in many fronts. You know, yours sadly at the moment, Natalie, with precarity and everything else, is just as battling, and that's not how we think it should be, right?
We have people very politely putting their hands up, so I will call them, Karen and then Kate.
Yeah, my thoughts are on what Kate was saying about the some of the challenges for people at the very top who we would expect to perform that more sisterly role, other than you know, as you said, Azuma. And I just wonder sometimes, it's always been something that's sort of niggled in my own mind. Is it a certain type of person, somebody that's happened to sort of keep the status quo, that gets to the top in the first place? You know, if you're the thorn in the side that's always trying to push things forward, are you going to get there anyway? So you know, yeah, that there is that too. Who is it that makes it to the top? Have they got that agenda, or have they got other agendas? Is it more about their own career, perhaps?
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Kate?
Yes, just to come back on Deborah's point about the fragility, and I mean, I think that was shown like within months during COVID, wasn't it? I mean, the disproportionate disadvantage that women globally, women professionally, women in all senses that women faced during COVID and lived through during COVID was, we went kind of skidding right back to, God knows when, and I think that's been a bit forgotten now, as have many things that happened during COVID, that we could use as a sort of more of a effective learning tool now, and I think that fragility of progress and position is one.
Natalie, okay, I'm going to offer the last word to Natalie, conscious that it is 2 minutes towards our conclusion. So Natalie, please.
Yes, I was just going to add, I think this notion of, a woman but not a sister, or I think people from certain groups that you'd expect to act in a particular way, not acting in that particular way. And I think a good reflection is on, I think it comes from kind of the school of thought on like decoloniality, is this concept of above and below, and considering who is above in every situation, and that changes and that shifts. And I think it again speaks to maybe the balancing act that you were talking about. Who is above changes based on your role. And essentially the commitment then is to act always from below and to the left. And part of that is thinking about whether maybe you're coming in from above into the left, because then that shifts things and that shifts dynamics. And I think even in your work, when you're considering, like Amanda and Kate were thinking about coloniality and equitable relationships, to consider in that context, am I above and to the left, even though when I'm at home, perhaps I am below and to the left, and thinking about how those shift, to consider just where we might look for, I think, kind of like unity or sisterhood, or looking for people who may in that way support us. And I think that's why perhaps sometimes it's important to transcend the immediate identity and go on a larger scope and think, actually, who in this context is below and who is to the left. So yeah.
That's lovely. Thank you very much. And I love those sort of spatial metaphors that are going there, and how people can position them within them. It is 2 o'clock, and so like every good FE teacher knows, it's time for us to conclude. I know we've all got other things to do. It's been a really brilliant discussion, and I'm sure everybody agrees with me that we could have carried on for quite some time, talking with whoever wants to be in the room. But thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Natalie. I would encourage you all to write a blog, please, if any of you would like to, for Bera, about the event, if you've got time, if you've got inclination. I'm a great believer in blogging. 750 words, it almost just clears my head. I'm stuck on the image of the juggler and the woman carrying the things from Vietnam. I've just got those 2 images in my head. So God knows what a blog would look like if I base it on those ideas. But do be in touch, and it's been really brilliant to be part of the discussion, and thank you.